Alright, so one thing with these tractor Zoomies is there's a lot of high vibrational force on each weld. So this is ultimately why I decided to go with mild steel as opposed to stainless steel, which stainless steel has a lot of chromium added into it, which gives it the stainless properties. The thing is that the chromium also makes the material a lot more brittle. So being that tractor Zoomies are under a lot of vibrational force, we didn't want to use a brittle material. We wanted to use a more ductile material, which is why mild steel was a good option for this application. So mild steel, it comes with a lot of mill scale on it. The mill scale is used to sort of protect the material from rusting when it's just in storage or whatever. But especially on this bracket, the mill scale is just real thick. So we wanted to go at it with an angle grinder because it's actually possible to, hit it on a convolute wheel or with a polishing wheel or whatever, and you're actually just polishing the mill scale. You want to use something that's pretty abrasive, so you're actually getting the mill scale off of the material. We don't want to be welding over any of the mill scale. It's just more dirt and debris that could introduce weld discontinuities and increase our chances of cracking on our welds. So we just want to clean everything up really, really good. Our mandrel bends they pretty much just come with usually some form of a protective grease. There's not really too much mill scale on them, so we'll just hit them up on the convolute wheel. Sometimes on the inside of the mandrel, you'll actually there'll be like a waxy substance, and that's actually used in the mandrel bending process to help remove the mandrel inside the tube, as well as to help any mandrel deformation along the bend. But we want to use isopropyl alcohol, clean that out of there, make sure we don't have any of that getting on the tube. Now, we really shouldn't even be penetrating into the tube too much. Now, on a fillet weld, what will oftentimes happen is you'll suck back on the inside of the tube. And now that is something we really, really, really want to make sure we avoid. We don't want any suck back on the inside of our tube. That's a really common cause for cracking on pieces like these. So the way to prevent that is, one, we don't want to run too hot on the fillet welds on the bracket, in between the bracket and the tubes. So we want to have the correct amperage input, and you want to make sure that you're introducing enough filler rod into your weld. That's a huge part of reducing your chances of having suck back. Another place that's super common, not in this particular product, but on tube copes, on whatever, if you have maybe like a wastegate, something or whatever, any application where you have a tube cope, those are really common areas to have suck back. They really like to tend to suck back on tube copes. So anytime you're welding the tube cope, you want to add a lot of filler rod, really push it in and really be liberal with it to really make sure you don't get sucked back, because that's a really, really common way for welds to crack. Another thing we're gonna go ahead and do is we're gonna preheat this piece before we start welding. We want to preheat the piece before we start welding, because if we don't preheat the piece, when we actually go to weld it out, the rest of the piece will be so cold that it'll draw heat out of the weld so fast that it'll actually could potentially cause the weld to crack, just because it's expanding and contracting so quick. So we want to alleviate some of that stress by preheating the part, so that way there's not as much room for the heat to dissipate as quickly. We want to just kind of have a level temperature for a prolonged period of time to prevent any chance of cracking. Now what you see here is that if you notice in the weld, I actually caught what at the time I thought was a gust of wind, but it was actually the cap on the inside, or the screw where it connects to my line, was loose. So it pulled in a little bit of oxygen. I had a little bit of porosity there, and anytime you get porosity, you have to grind it out. You might run into people on in some production shop or whatever that say like you can just weld over it, but in an application like this, you cannot just weld over porosity. If you get any porosity, you have to grind it out, because if you try to weld over porosity, you might be able to hide it, but it's still in there. You cannot weld porosity out of the puddle. It'll always be in there. You have to grind it out. So another thing that's really important when it comes to welding out these Zoomies is the sequencing of the welds. So we start by welding the inside of the flange first, and the reason we do this is that it's just another step that we can use to help minimize warpage. So when we weld the inside of the flange, it's the way that the weld is orientated is that it's not going to be able to pull the flange out of position, but what it will do is that when we go to weld the outside, there'll be a little bit more material and a little bit more internal resistance to the forces of warpage on the outside. So basically that'll just help us minimize any chance of our flange warping. So one thing you can hopefully see here in the weld puddle is that we're adding a good amount of filler material on each dab. We want to make sure that we fill the weld up to an even level on the face. We don't want to have a sunken face on the weld. We don't want any concavity on the weld that'll lead to a crack. As you can see here, concavity, there's just more stress, there's less material, there's less resistance to the vibrational forces on the Zoomies when they're in operation. So we want to make sure that we add a good amount of filler rod into the weld so we have a good strong weld. We have a lot of material there to resist the vibrational force. You can see here in the shot, really pushing a good amount of filler rod on each dab. And as you can see on the machine here, you know, I only had the 110 outlet, so we're maxed out. I would almost even say I could have ran a little bit hotter, but this did just fine. Ran a little bit slower, just making sure that on each dab we're filling up each dab. Just fill it in, move over about 1/16 of an inch, fill it up. And all we're really doing is looking to make sure that the toe lines wet into the material good, that we're not getting any cold roll, it's not rolling over funny, it's not picking up any pieces of debris or anything like that. We just want a good clean looking puddle that fills up to the right size and the toe lines stay straight. And as you can see here, we're just dabbing along, keeping those toe lines nice and straight. And you can see the puddle's looking nice and clean. We don't have any garbage floating around in the puddle stays clean. Our filler rod's clean, we just keep the puddle clean, we keep it hot, and we keep it filled.